Let me ask you a very serious question. Why do you still believe that a perfectly slack line is the only way to fool a cautious fish? You cast out, leave the line completely loose, and sit there thinking your setup is absolutely invisible to the world. But the moment that fierce spring breeze hits the water, your bite alarm starts beeping for no logical reason, and your bait is quietly dragged halfway across the lake without you even knowing. Today we are going to talk about why your beloved slackline technique fails completely when the spring wind picks up. I am going to show you the ugly truth about what is really happening under the surface while you are sitting in your chair waiting for a bite. I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at a windy day on the bank the same way again. In fact, you are going to realize that you have probably been scaring the fish away all by yourself. Tell me in the comments right now, do you tighten up or stay slack when the wind starts blowing hard? Let us see how many of you are actually doing it right. Let us set the scene and understand why this is such a massive problem. We all know how important bait presentation is. For decades, the older guys, the absolute legends of the lake, have told us that a tight line is a dead giveaway. They told us that a tight line acts exactly like a guitar string under the water, vibrating in the current and spooking every single fish within a 100-yard radius. So we all learned to fish slack. We let the line sink all the way down, lay it gently across the bottom contours, and just wait. It makes perfect sense in theory, right? You want your rig to look natural and untouched, and on a perfectly still morning, when the lake looks like a giant mirror, it works beautifully. But real fishing is never a controlled laboratory experiment. The weather changes fast. Spring is notoriously famous for those brutal, unpredictable winds that whip across the water out of nowhere. Yet, so many of us stubbornly stick to the same old habit. We watch our lines bow out violently in the wind. We listen to the gusts howling through the trees, and we just hope for the best. Simply because breaking a rule we learned 20 years ago feels like a crime. Picture this exact scenario, because we have all been there. You arrive at the lake just before dawn on a beautiful early spring morning. The water is completely flat, resembling a giant sheet of dark, polished glass. The birds are just starting to sing in the trees, and you feel that familiar rush of excitement in your chest. You set up your rod pod, attach your carefully tied rigs, and cast out to your absolute favorite spot near the island. Everything feels absolutely perfect. You let the line sink all the way to the bottom, attach your bobbins, and set them with just the right amount of slack so they rest perfectly on the ground. You sit back in your chair, wrap your cold hands around a hot cup of coffee, and wait for the magic to happen. You are fully convinced that your presentation is flawless and completely invisible to any passing fish. And for the first 2 or 3 hours, it truly is. But then, as the sun creeps higher into the sky, the atmosphere begins to shift drastically. You feel a sudden cold breeze brush against your face. The trees behind your tent start to rustle loudly. You look out at the water, and that perfect morning mirror is now covered in small, aggressive ripples. You do not think much of it at first. As the morning progresses, that gentle breeze turns into a steady, relentless spring wind. You know exactly the kind of wind I am talking about. It is the type of wind that makes your eyes water and forces you to zip your jacket all the way up to your chin. You sit in your chair and watch the surface of the lake transform into a choppy, restless sea. Small whitecaps start to form out in the middle of the water. Now, I want you to look closely at where your line enters the water. When the lake was calm, your line went straight down, disappearing neatly beneath the surface. But now, with the wind howling across the water, the surface tension is violently pushing against your line. You might notice your bobbin slowly creeping up towards the rod blank. Your very first instinct, based on years of habit, is to pull a little more line off the reel spool. You think that if you just give it a bit more slack, the line will eventually settle back down on the lake bed and everything will be fine. You strip off another yard of line, let the bobbin drop back down, and sit back with a sigh of relief. But what you do not realize is that you have just made the problem 10 times worse. Let us break down exactly what happens when you feed that extra slack into the water during a strong wind. You are essentially feeding line into a chaotic washing machine, and you have just lost complete control over what is happening out there in the depths. The biggest myth in fishing is that a heavy sinker will magically anchor your slack line and keep everything in place. You think because you have a 4-ounce lead sitting in the mud, your line will just rest peacefully between the rod tip and the rig. But physics simply does not work that way. The line you just pulled off the reel does not sink straight down. Instead, the aggressive surface chop grabs hold of the line before it can even break the surface tension. The wind acts like an invisible hand, grabbing the line and pushing it sideways across the top of the water. Because you gave it slack, there is no tension to fight the wind. The line begins to travel with the waves, creating a massive, sweeping arc right there on the surface. You are sitting there thinking your line is pinned to the bottom, but in reality, the first 20 yards of your line are surfing across the top of the lake. Now we need to talk about the concept of surface drift, because this is where the disaster truly begins. When a strong spring wind blows across a lake, it does not just make waves, it actually pushes the entire top layer of water in the direction the wind is blowing. This moving layer of water has an incredible amount of force behind it. Imagine a river flowing across the surface of the lake. When your line enters this moving water, especially when it is slack and has no tension to hold it straight, it gets caught in the current. The water pushes against the surface area of the line, dragging it further and further to the side. If the wind is blowing left to right, your line is now sweeping in a massive curve to the right. The more slack you give it, the larger that curve becomes. This surface drift is relentless. It never stops pulling. You might look at your rod tips and see that the line enters the water at a completely different angle than where you actually cast your rig. You cast straight ahead, but your line is now pointing at an angle 45 degrees to your right. This is your first visual warning that your presentation is falling apart. But the nightmare does not end at the surface. We have to look at what is happening underneath, which brings us to the undertow effect. This is a concept that so many fishermen completely ignore. Think about it logically for a second. If the wind is constantly pushing thousands of gallons of water toward one side of the lake, all that water has to go somewhere when it hits the bank. It cannot just stack up and flood the fields. What happens is that the water hits the bank, dives down to the bottom, and flows all the way back in the opposite direction. This creates a powerful, unseen underwater current called an undertow. So, you have the surface water pulling your line to the right and the bottom water pulling your line back to the left. If you are fishing with a slack line, your line is caught in a violent tug of war between two opposing forces of water. It is twisting, bending and turning into a giant zigzag shape through the water column. There is absolutely nothing stealthy or natural about this. Your line is behaving like a piece of debris caught in a storm, and you are entirely oblivious because you are sitting in your tent. Because of these opposing currents, the bow in your line becomes massive. I want you to visualize the shape of your line underwater. You cast your bait 60 yards out. You think you have a straight line connecting your rod tip to your lead. But because of the surface drift and the undertow acting on your slack line, you actually have 80 or 90 yards of line wandering aimlessly through the lake. It forms a giant letter S, or a massive parachute shape. This means you have completely lost direct contact with your rig. Direct contact is the most crucial element in feeling a bite and hooking a fish. With a massive bow in your line, a fish could literally pick up your bait, chew on it, spit it out, and swim away, and your bobbin would not move a single inch. The fish would have to swim 20 or 30 yards just to pull the slack out of that massive curve before your bite alarm would ever make a sound. You are essentially fishing completely blind. You are relying on pure luck that a fish hooks itself violently enough to eventually pull all that wandering line tight. This is a terrible strategy for any serious angler. And then comes the most annoying part of fishing in the wind with a slack line: the false bites. You are sitting by your rods, maybe having a chat with a friend from the next swim, and suddenly your alarm lets out a loud, sharp beep. Your heart jumps into your throat. You rush over to the rods, hovering your hand over the handle, ready to strike. The bobbin slowly creeps up an inch. You hold your breath, waiting for that screaming run. But then, the bobbin just drops back down. Nothing happens. 10 minutes later, another single beep. This psychological torture goes on for hours. You start to think that there are cautious fish out there, just playing with your bait, picking it up and dropping it. You start questioning your rig mechanics, wondering if your hooks are dull or if your bait is wrong. But let me tell you the harsh truth. There are no fish down there playing with your bait. Those beeps are entirely caused by the wind and the underwater currents pushing and pulling against that massive bow in your slack line. The current catches the line, tightens it just enough to lift the bobbin, and then releases it. You are literally getting bites from the weather. While you are busy getting frustrated by those false beeps, something much worse is happening down on the bottom of the lake. Remember that massive parachute shape your slack line has formed? Water is heavy, and moving water exerts an unbelievable amount of pressure on any surface it touches. As the undertow and surface drift continuously push against the massive curve in your line, the pressure builds up. Eventually that pressure becomes greater than the holding power of your heavy lead. And what happens next? The line actually begins to physically drag your lead across the bottom of the lake. Very slowly, inch by inch, your perfectly placed rig is being pulled away from the spot where you cast it. If you spent an hour carefully feeding a specific gravel patch with loose bait, placing your rig right in the middle of it, you can kiss that strategy goodbye. The wind and the slack line are dragging your bait totally out of the feeding zone. It ends up dragging into the thick mud, hiding the hook bait, or pulling away from the free offerings completely. Your presentation is entirely ruined without you touching the rod. To make matters even more complicated, we have to talk about the weed and debris problem. Spring is a time when the lake is waking up, but there is still a lot of dead weed from the winter floating around. When the spring wind blows hard, it pushes all this loose debris, dead reeds, and floating algae across the surface of the lake. If your line is dropping straight down and tight, most of this debris will safely float right past it. But remember, you are fishing a slack line. Your line is laying across the surface in a massive curve, creating a perfect trap for everything blowing across the lake. Within an hour, massive clumps of wet, heavy weed will catch onto your line. This adds incredible weight and drag to the line. As the wind pushes the weed clump pulls the line, and the line pulls your rig even faster across the bottom. I've seen guys reel in their rigs only to find 50 pounds of dead weed attached to the line, and their rig dragged 50 yards to the left into a snag. All because they refused to tighten up their lines in the wind. Now, let us imagine a best-case scenario where your rig has not been dragged too far, and a hungry fish actually finds your bait. It sucks the bait in, feels the prick of the hook, and panics. The fish bolts, shaking its head to get rid of the rig. If you were fishing a tight line, the heavy lead would immediately set the hook deep into the bottom lip of the fish, and your alarm would instantly scream. But you are fishing slack. When the fish bolts, the heavy lead does not work effectively because the fish is just pulling against the massive spongy bow of slack line stretching across the lake. The strike is completely delayed. The fish has precious extra seconds to shake its head violently, use the weight of the lead against you, and spit the hook before your bobbin even registers a single movement. By the time that delayed tension finally reaches your rod tip and your alarm sounds, the fish is often already gone. You hear a couple of beeps, lift the rod, and feel absolutely nothing but empty water. You curse your bad luck, not realizing your technique was the actual problem. It is time we have an honest conversation about breaking the golden rules. We all respect our grandfathers and the old-school anglers who taught us everything. They preached that tight lines vibrate and scare fish. In a calm, shallow margin, they are absolutely right. But applying that logic to a howling spring gale in deep water is madness. We have to compare reality to theory. Yes, a perfectly tight line might have a slight vibration in the wind. But let us look at the alternative. Your slack line is currently bowed out 30 yards, flapping wildly in the undertow, dragging your heavy lead across the gravel and sweeping through the water column like a rogue snake. Which one of those scenarios do you honestly think is more terrifying to a cautious fish? A stationary line going straight down to the lead, or a chaotic, moving obstacle course of loose line dragging through their feeding area? Modern reality dictates that a stationary rig is always better than a moving one. Sticking to Grandad's advice in the wrong weather conditions is exactly why you are going home without a catch. Let us take a moment to look at this from the perspective of the fish. Fish are incredibly sensitive creatures. They rely on their lateral lines to detect tiny changes in water pressure and movement. When a carp approaches a baited area, it expects things to be relatively stable on the bottom, even if the surface is choppy. Imagine a carp swimming down to inspect your bait. It is moving slowly, tasting the water. Suddenly, a thick piece of fishing line sweeps across its flank because the undertow just dragged the slack line sideways. Or it watches your bright pop-up slowly drag itself across the mud as the wind pushes the line above. That is completely unnatural behavior. In the wild, food does not drag itself against the current for no reason. The moment the fish senses that unnatural movement or feels that sweeping slack line brush against its fins, the alarm bells go off in its head. The fish bolts, taking any other feeding fish with it. Your attempt to be stealthy with a slack line has literally turned your setup into a mobile scarecrow. The psychology of the angler plays a massive role in this failure. Why do we refuse to adapt? It is because sitting in the bivvy, listening to the wind, is much more comfortable than facing reality. We convince ourselves that if we just leave the rods alone, eventually a fish will come along. We see the line bowing, we see the bobbin sitting awkwardly on the ground, and we just ignore the warning signs. It is a stubborn refusal to admit that our initial strategy was wrong for the current conditions. Taking the time to reel in, untangle the weed, cast out again in a crosswind, and reset everything with a tight line takes a lot of effort. It is cold outside, the wind is biting, and you would rather just stay in your sleeping bag. So you leave the slack line out there, hoping for a miracle. You are essentially crossing your fingers instead of actively fishing. But hope is not a strategy. The moment you notice the wind completely ruining your slack presentation, you have to find the motivation to get out of the chair and completely change your approach. Laziness costs you fish. Sometimes anglers try to find a middle ground, and this is what we call the semi-slack compromise. They realize the wind is bad, but they still fear a totally tight line. So they put a heavier bobbin on, but leave the line just a little bit loose, hoping the heavy indicator will pin everything down without creating that dreaded guitar string effect. This is perhaps the worst of both worlds. A heavy bobbin on a semi-slack line creates sharp, dangerous angles. It pulls the line tight near the rod, but leaves a massive curve out in the water where the wind hits it. The heavy bobbin constantly bounces in the wind gusts, yanking the line sharply and sending aggressive vibrations straight down to the hookbait. Instead of a smooth, sweeping drag, the rig is now being aggressively jerked across the bottom every time the wind gusts. You get even more false bites, the rig gets tangled, and the presentation looks like a seizure on the lake bed. You cannot half commit to adapting. In a strong spring wind, you either have to fish totally slack in a sheltered bay or lock it up tight. Let us talk about visual indicators and what they are actually trying to tell you. Your bobbin is not just a weight to trigger the alarm. It is a communication device between the rig and your eyes. When you are fishing a slack line in the wind, pay close attention to how the bobbin behaves. If it is sitting on the floor, but occasionally twitching and lifting an inch or two before dropping back, the undertow is pulling your line. If the bobbin slowly creeps all the way to the top and stays there under tension, the surface drift has completely bowed your line out and is now actively dragging your lead. Many anglers see the bobbin at the top, assume a fish took the bait and dropped it, and just pull a few more feet of line off the reel to let the bobbin drop back down. This is absolute insanity. You are literally feeding more line to the monster. Every time you drop that bobbin back down by giving slack, you are allowing the wind to drag your rig another 10 feet out of position. The indicator is screaming at you that the line is out of control, but you are responding by giving up more control. There is a specific scenario that turns a slack line into an absolute nightmare, and that is the drop-back bite. Imagine a fish picks up your bait, and instead of swimming away, it turns and swims directly towards the bank where you are sitting. If you are fishing a tight line, the bobbin immediately drops like a stone, the alarm sounds, and you know exactly what is happening. But let us look at the slack line in the wind. The fish swims towards you, carrying the lead. However, because the wind and the undertow have created a massive, tight curve of slack line out to the side, the tension on the bobbin does not change. The water pressure is holding the curve tight, even though the fish is moving closer. The fish can swim 20 yards directly at you, completely dislodging the rig, and your bobbin will not drop a single millimeter. You will have absolutely no idea that a fish is on the end of the line until it suddenly swims sideways and hits the main tension of the bow. By then, it has probably swam into a snag or spat the hook. Now, I hear a lot of people talking about line materials. The common argument is that if you use a heavy, sinking fluorocarbon mainline, you can still fish a slack line in the wind because the heavy material will pin itself to the bottom and ignore the surface drift. This is a very dangerous myth. Yes, fluorocarbon sinks much faster and is generally heavier than standard monofilament. But water pressure is incredibly powerful. When you have thousands of gallons of water moving in an undertow, the sheer force of that moving water will lift and push even the heaviest fluorocarbon line. It might take 10 minutes longer to bow out than monofilament, but the end result is exactly the same. The line will sweep, curve, and eventually drag the lead. Believing that a specific type of line will save a flawed technique in extreme weather is just another excuse to avoid adapting. Heavy line helps in mild conditions, but when the real spring gales arrive, physics will always defeat heavy line if there is no tension holding it straight. Another massive danger of the sweeping slack line is what I call the topography trap. The bottom of the lake is rarely perfectly flat. There are gravel bars, steep drop-offs, mussel beds, and sunken trees. When you cast a straight, tight line, you can position it safely away from these hazards. But when you fish a slack line in the wind, that massive bow wanders blindly across the lake bed. The wind pushes your line sideways, right over the top of a sharp gravel bar, or straight into a sunken tree branch. The line settles into these snags. When you finally go to reel in, or worse, when you actually hook a fish, your line is firmly wrapped around an underwater obstacle. You lift the rod, the line grinds against sharp zebra mussels, and suddenly everything goes completely limp. Your main line is cut clean through. You lose the fish, the rig, and yards of expensive line, simply because you allowed the wind to blow your slack line into a danger zone that you could have easily avoided by keeping things tight. There is always that painful moment of realization when the truth finally hits you. It usually happens when you finally decide to reel in and change your bait after 4 frustrating hours of false beeps and zero action. You pick up the rod, expecting to feel the lead lift off the spot where you cast it right in front of you. Instead, as you reel, the rod tip points 40 yards down the bank to your left. You reel in hundreds of yards of line that you did not even know was out there. When the rig finally surfaces, it is covered in thick, smelly black mud, rotting leaves, and a massive ball of dead weed. The hook bait is totally masked. It is right then that you realize your bait has not been fishing effectively for the last 3 hours and 50 minutes. You wasted the entire morning sitting in a chair, watching a dead rod, because you trusted the slack line technique in the wrong conditions. It is a humbling experience, but it is also the best lesson you can possibly learn. It forces you to accept that adaptation is the key to success. The ultimate shift in mindset is accepting that you must fish for the conditions you actually have, not the conditions you wish you had. When the spring wind is tearing across the lake, tearing the surface apart, you have to abandon the stealthy slack line. You need to cast out, let the heavy lead hit the bottom, and sink the rod tips under the water if possible to avoid the surface drift. Then you reel down tight until you feel the solid weight of the lead. You lock the bobbin on a tight line. Yes, it might look less natural in a textbook. Yes, the old school guys might shake their heads. But a tight line cuts directly through the moving water column. It presents minimal surface area for the undertow to grab. It keeps your rig totally locked in position on the feeding spot. It provides instant indication the millisecond a fish makes a mistake. You transition from hoping and guessing to actually being in complete control of your gear. You stop fighting the wind and start beating it with logic and direct tension. So, let us bring it all together. The most unexpected turning point here is that the very technique you are using to be stealthy and natural is exactly what was making your rig chaotic, obvious, and terrifying to the fish. That is the real plot twist of spring fishing. You thought you were being an invisible ghost by using a slack line, but the spring wind turned your setup into a dragging, vibrating warning sign that literally pushed every fish out of your area. Understanding how surface drift and underwater undertow manipulate a loose line changes your entire approach to fishing in rough weather. It gives you the power and confidence to tighten up, keep direct contact with your heavy lead, and actually know exactly what is happening at the business end of your rod. Suddenly, the wind is no longer your worst enemy, but just another environmental condition that you know exactly how to defeat. Thank you so much for watching and spending your time with me today. If this video changed the way you look at a windy day on the bank, please hit that subscribe button and leave a big like on the video. It really helps out. Now I want to hear from you. What is the absolute worst fishing trip you have ever experienced because of brutal spring winds? And how did you try to fix the situation? Let us get a great conversation going down in the comments.